Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, look yourselves desolate, servants, peasants, vassals, minions, citizens. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I'm going to go back and bitch about the good old USA. And when I'm bitching about the USA, of course I'm going to bitch about the government because that's our basic problem in the USA. And one of my favorite things to pick on, and I have this in common with my compatriot John Barleycorn, and so he'll really appreciate this video because we're getting back to the bloat and fat in our government, and in this case, the gravy train for federal employees. And once again, we have this massive bureaucracy. If you think about just the fact that the Department of Homeland Security now has 250,000 employees, and that's only the latest department that was created after 9/11. So it's only been around for 12 years or so, and 13 years. And they have these massive benefits programs. And everybody knows, of course, about all the pensions, the much higher salaries than the private sector, all the benefits, all the holidays, etc. But you get into some other programs that just really add to what a big fat gravy train it is. It explains why politicians become politicians. It explains why people go into the government sector, and explains why people in the government sector are very supportive of these politicians. They all have the same drive here and end up with the same gravy train. And just like politicians, our career politicians, government workers, are career government workers. So anyway, let's get down to the gruesome details. We have a government accounting office report, and they looked at a 3-year period between 2010 and 2013, and over 57,000 federal workers were put on administrative leave for 30 days or more. So in the scheme of things, that's a small number. But the fact that taxpayer dollars go so that nearly 60,000 federal employees can go on administrative leave for 30 days or more. And I want to ask how many people out there who work in the private sector have the ability to be put on a month's paid vacation in order to sort out the details of your job. And of course, we also know that police, for example, are often put on administrative leave after shootings and other events. And so if there's some sort of investigation going on, and they get a lot of paid time off. And it just is in sharp contrast to what we in the private sector, we don't have these kind of cushions. And when you get into the details of this report, 53,000 of those 57,000 were paid from 1 to 3 months. So 1 to 3 month paid vacations. And a small percentage, relatively 4,000, had 3 months to a year, and fewer than 100 of these had a year to 3 years paid administrative leave. So still pretty outrageous that 100 people or 4,000 people, either of those categories, ends up with 3 months to a year or a year to 3 years of just these paid vacations. This is at a total cost of $775 million, so upwards, pushing up into the territory of $1 billion paid in administrative leave for federal employees. And that's just for that one 3-year period. And a lot of these have to do with whistleblowers, although as you would imagine, there aren't that many whistleblowers. A lot of it has to do with personnel disputes and misconduct accusations. So this makes it all the more insulting that all this $1 billion of paid vacations is just to sort out misconduct accusations and personnel disputes. So once again, I ask, how many in the private sector can indulge in this sort of nonsense? And another way it's used, too, a good example, is Lois Lerner, who resigned from the IRS in the scandal, and just before she officially retires. So she resigns, but she gets 4 months of paid vacation, and then hits her retirement mark, so she can continue to get her government pension, I would assume. I don't know the details. Anyone can feel free to correct me on that. So there's one example of these extra paid vacations that a lot of federal employees get. And of course, a lot of these benefits are available to local government workers as well. And let's get to this other story that ties in with that. And that's because we have a credit card problem with federal employees as well. It turns out that there's 3.5 million charge card accounts for government employees. And this is run through the General Services Administration. And everybody's already familiar with the excesses of the General Services Administration throwing lavish parties and spending a lot of money for those parties. But it's the largest charge card program in the world, and it was set up in 1998 just for all 350 federal agencies. And it's called Smart Pay, and it's on a massive scale. I'm sure most people haven't thought about this, but it's pretty outrageous once again that we have these free money given credit cards and this free money given to all these federal employees. And I want to remind everyone too that when you think about the amount of money generated by government credit cards given to federal employees, a fairly large amount of consumption. Some of the only consumption that's going on these days, I would imagine, is actually the government passing out these credit cards to federal agencies. So just another fraud going into the recovery and going into the economy. When in 2011 there was 100 million transactions on government credit cards, $30.8 billion in charges. That's staggering numbers. In 2012, it was a little less, 95.6 million transactions, and $29.32 billion in charges. So think about that, $30 billion going into the economy, once again, just on credit for one thing, but also government finance credit. And boy, what a shocker. Turns out, guess who runs the General Services Administration Smart Pay credit card accounts for federal employees? Citibank, U.S. Bank, and J.P. Morgan Chase. And I'm sure they've got some pretty nice interest rates on those too. And that's without going into how much financial problems there are with these cards. I don't know how many government employees have problems paying these bills or default or just stop paying them, and what kind of mechanisms are in play in the government to address these issues. I would assume none. I would assume there's hardly any oversight whatsoever. And in fact, there's a government accounting office audit from 2008. It's the only one I have figures for here. And it showed that 41% of purchases made on these government credit cards were inappropriate. And 48% of transactions on these government transactions of $2,500 or more violated federal rules. So that goes to show that at least 50% of these cards are being abused. And that means $15 billion in fraudulent charges by government employees, using yet another example of the government gravy train. And there were some specific examples. One was a U.S. Postal Service worker who spent $1,100 on his government credit card over 6 months for online dating. Or a U.S. Forest Service worker who wrote her boyfriend $640,000 in convenience checks over 6 years. So how much oversight do you think there is if someone can write convenience checks for 6 years to the tune of $640,000? So there's two good examples of more government federal worker gravy train. It's bad enough that we pay lifetime pensions, which are then passed on to their spouses. It's enough that we pay for government health care for all federal workers for the lifetime. It's bad enough that they make a much higher pay than the private sector, and we have this huge bloated bureaucracy, and yet on top of that they get credit cards and paid vacations. It's like being on a game show. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.